would say, first of all, we know each other better than we did 30 years ago. When Ambassador Clark was here, I think that the people of Uzbekistan and the people of the United States were still learning about each other. I think our expectations about each other are more realistic. But as a result, I think our relationship is mature. And that's a good thing. We recognize that, it's about our own interests. It's a generous thing on the one hand. It's a humanitarian thing to do to help other countries, but it's also self-interested, because as long as the virus is out there, it's going to come back and reinfect people in the United States too. The WTO accession that Uzbekistan is seeking is an important factor here, and I just want to emphasize that we think that if Uzbekistan succeeds in getting into WTO, and we're helping in that process as well, we're providing assistance on that, that will help the trade flows. U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan, best job I ever had.
Hello dear Uzbek World viewers, our distinguished guest today is Mr. Daniel Rosenblum, U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan. Mr. Rosenblum, we are very happy to receive you.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
The first ever U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan, Henry Lee Clark, has recently unveiled his plans to author a book on his 3-year-old diplomatic journey. If you had to write a book now or 3 decades later after your appointment, what would be its title, and what do you think has changed in the U.S.-Uzbekistan relations since then?
So a lot has changed because it's been 30 years. And I would say, first of all, we know each other better than we did 30 years ago. When Ambassador Clark was here, I think that the people of Uzbekistan and the people of the United States were still learning about each other. Because we have to remember that during the period of the Soviet Union, it was much more difficult to travel. The country was not open in the same way it is now. And not many Americans understood anything about Uzbekistan, its culture, its history, its people. And I think the same goes in the other direction. I think not too many Uzbeks knew very much about America. Today, 30 years later, there's so much travel back and forth. There are people who have emigrated to the United States and they still have family here. And there's a lot of business going back and forth as well. And I think as a result, we know each other better. We also, because we know each other better, I think our expectations about each other are more realistic. 30 years later, we're more realistic. We know each other better. But as a result, I think our relationship is mature. And that's a good thing. And it also has allowed us to develop cooperation in so many different areas that we weren't doing 30 years ago. And then on your question about the book, you asked me about writing a book. I would say that I hope in 30 years that I have the energy and the persistence to actually write a book. I don't know if I will. I compliment Ambassador Clark for his project of doing that. If I had a title, I can't think of a title right now except maybe U.S. Ambassador to Uzbekistan, best job I ever had.
So it's going to be the title.
Maybe.
What do you think can be considered as the country's most important accomplishment in the last 30 years?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, I think the answer to that question is going to change over time as people look back. I would say that the most important accomplishment to date is establishing Uzbekistan's independence and sovereignty on a very firm basis. And it's not an easy thing to do. And this is a country, it's still a young country, as the president often says. And it needed time to figure out how to define itself in the world. And that meant a lot of time spent in finding the historical legacy that was the basis for the nation, developing the language more, and Uzbek language and pride in the language, developing an appreciation for culture that comes from ancestors and comes from hundreds and even thousands of years ago, and figuring out how that culture fits into the modern world. And then lastly, figuring out what kind of relationship the country wanted to have with its neighbors and with its faraway neighbors too, or faraway countries like the United States. And all of that took a lot of hard work, and it's still going on. It's not over, but I think 30 years later, Uzbekistan is recognized everywhere as a strong, sovereign, independent country with its own identity, and that's an accomplishment. That's a fantastic accomplishment, I think.
What kind of change have you encountered in the last 3 years as you were able to observe the country and its developments?
So, yeah, I've been here, living here for almost 3 years, 2.5 years so far. You know, there's so many things that change every day, and it's hard to just pick a few, but I'll try. First of all, I would say that I've seen a change, I think, in the time I've been here, in the expectations that people have, citizens have, of their government. And I think this is something that President Mirziyoyev has tried hard to cultivate himself. I've heard him say in many speeches, the role of the state is not to, the role of the state is to serve the people, not the other way around. It's not the people who are there to serve the state. And I actually think that before President Mirziyoyev came into office, it often was the other way around. And so changing that way of looking at the relationship between the government and the state and the citizens has been a significant change. And I've seen just in the time that I've been here, I think that ordinary citizens, people living all around the country, now expect more of their government and demand more. And that can sometimes be uncomfortable for government officials, but it's a necessary change if you're going to build a modern society with a democratic system. So that change is something I've seen just in the time I've been here, gradual. The other change I think that is noteworthy is in terms of infrastructure and building. Just driving around Tashkent, going to other regions as well, because I've traveled in many regions of the country. There's been a lot of new infrastructure, new transportation, new airplanes, Uzbekistan Airways, and that's a good thing. It represents, you know, improvement in people's ability to get from one place to another or to find a good workplace. It is important, though, that development like that, including infrastructure, take into account things like environmental impact and quality of life for people living in a city. I know there's been some protests against some of the development here in Tashkent because it involved cutting down a lot of trees or, you know, removing parks and so on. But again, going back to my first point, this represents a change in people's attitude towards the state, because now they say we can push back against this. You know, if we think there's something wrong with it, and that's a healthy development. So anyway, those are things that stand out that I've seen in the last 3 years, even in the last 3 years, change.
So how would you name them? What is a major one?
Well, I think the first one I talked about is the most important for the long run, which is the change in people's expectations of what government should do for them, and how it should respect their rights and so on. I think that will have the biggest impact in the long run.
Thank you so much. And in late July, the United States has delivered more than 3 million doses of the US manufactured Moderna vaccine. And so far, the United States has allocated more than $3.5 billion to help the world fight the pandemic through COVAX program. The United States is now leading in the number of registered COVID-19 cases. And at the same time, it helps so many countries. How can you explain this phenomenon?
I think, first of all, you're right that the U.S. is the biggest contributor to the global fight against the pandemic. In particular, the vaccination distribution through the COVAX facility, we are, as you noted, are the biggest contributor to it. What doesn't get as much attention is that we've also done a lot in terms of providing technical assistance to countries, including Uzbekistan, on how to respond to the pandemic, how to diagnose infections, how to treat patients who have COVID, how to handle data about, related to the pandemic, and also how to educate the public, how to talk to the public and give them information that they need. And we've been doing that steadily since the beginning of the pandemic through our USAID projects here, and we also have Centers for Disease Control. The CDC has an office in our embassy here in Tashkent, and they are working very closely with the Ministry of Health and other agencies. So that assistance has been going on all over the world. It doesn't cost as much money as the vaccines and other things, but it's really significant. So you asked how do you explain this phenomenon? And I think the answer is that the U.S. recognizes that we cannot defeat this pandemic alone. It has to be done together with the rest of the world. It has to be done internationally. And that's because, the virus doesn't respect borders, right? It travels over borders very easily. And the only way we're going to get a handle on it is to work together. That's why we've been glad to collaborate with COVAX and the United Nations and UNICEF in particular. And it's why we've done so much in other countries. And I think we recognize that, it's about our own interests. It's a generous thing on the one hand. It's a humanitarian thing to do to help other countries, but it's also self-interested because as long as the virus is out there, it's going to come back and reinfect people in the United States too. So, and the last point I want to make on this is on vaccines, specifically on vaccines. The experts tell us, the scientists and medical professionals, that as long as too few people are vaccinated, the virus is going to keep changing. It's going to keep mutating and new forms will arise. So the only way we're really going to stop this virus is to get a lot of people vaccinated. And that's why we've put so much effort into the COVAX facility and made the donations that we have, because we need vaccinations all over the world.
How would you assess Uzbekistan's response to the pandemic?
So I would assess it positively overall. I'm not a medical professional, so whatever I say, you have to understand I'm saying this just as an observer, not as an expert. But what I've seen is, first of all, I think the government of Uzbekistan responded very quickly and decisively when the pandemic first arrived, when the first case was diagnosed, and I give them a lot of credit for that. They took very strong and strict action at the beginning, and that probably avoided a really big wave of infections in the early phase. And the important thing there is, at the time, the medical system wasn't ready to handle it, right? And that's true. That's not just true here in Uzbekistan. That was true all over the world. Nobody knew how to deal with such a pandemic. We hadn't had a pandemic like this in 100 years. So everyone was unprepared, and Uzbekistan was no exception. But I think the government acted quickly and prevented a surge in the early stage. I also think that in the last year and a half, since the pandemic started, that the government has done a good job of building up the infrastructure to handle COVID infections and treat patients. There's a lot more hospital capacity now than there was a year and a half ago, and physicians have gotten the training and nurses have gotten the training they need. The U.S. has helped, other countries have helped, many countries internationally, but now Uzbekistan's in a much better place because of those investments. And the good thing that the government did was it was open to getting help. It reached out and encouraged all this assistance. So those are positives. And now, of course, the push for vaccination is very important. And the president himself and many other officials have really been out there trying to promote it. If there's any weaknesses in the response, the one that sticks out to me is about data and information about the numbers of cases and the numbers of deaths. Honestly, I think the numbers that we see published and publicly available are much lower than the actual situation. Again, I'm not an expert, but based on what I hear and what I pick up, I think there's an undercounting. And I don't think it's intentional. I don't think it's a cover-up or something. I think it's simply the systems for collecting data and for testing and so on are not as strong as they need to be. But overall, as I said at the beginning, I think it's been I assess it positively. It's in a positive response.
The sixth presidential elections are set to be held in October this year. How does the U.S. government assess the electoral campaign of the Republic?
You know, elections in our mind are an absolutely essential building block of democratic government. And you know, I think that's, it may be obvious, but I think it's important to state it, that having free and fair elections is essential to being able to say that you have a democratic society and a democratic government, because people need to have a choice of who is going to lead them. That's the foundation of it. So our hope and our expectation is that the process of holding the election will be held in a way that's transparent and fair and allows for real competition. The OSCE, which does election monitoring and was here in 2019 for the parliamentary elections, is planning to monitor this as well. I think the government has already made a request for OSCE monitoring, and the OSCE, I don't know if they've agreed formally, but we understand they will send a large team. We, as the United States government, often look to the OSCE as the sort of the gold standard for election monitoring, and I think in this case we will too. So we are going to support that mission. We're going to have, there'll be Americans participating among the observers, and we will look closely to see what the OSCE says, what it recommends coming out of the election before we make our own assessment. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we're providing some election-related assistance through USAID, and it's going to go to the Central Election Commission, the CEC. It involves some capacity building for election officials, and I think there's a component that involves helping voters who may have a harder time registering and voting, disabled people, for example, or people in very poor communities or remote communities, figuring out the best way to give them access so that they can be sure to vote. So we're supporting that effort as well. But yeah, we look forward, I won't make predictions, but we look forward to a very interesting fall and seeing the election process.
What, in your opinion, could be done to increase the volume of bilateral trade between Uzbekistan and the US? What are the prospects for growth, and what is the current situation?
Our bilateral trade is not as high as it should be. I think in 2020, which is the last year we have data, it was the total volume of trade back and forth was $275 million, which was down from the previous year. Some of that, I think, is because of the pandemic. I think the pandemic did affect trade flows because it made it more difficult for businesses to get orders and to figure out how they were going to transport things. But nonetheless, our goals are much, much higher. We would like to see it grow. The WTO accession that Uzbekistan is seeking is an important factor here. And I just want to emphasize that we think that if Uzbekistan succeeds in getting into WTO, and we're helping in that process as well, we're providing assistance on that, that will help the trade flows, because it will mean that Uzbekistan needs to meet certain standards, international standards on things like tariffs and certifications and so on. And it will make things easier for our exporters to sell here, and also for Uzbek business to sell in the United States. A couple of recent things that happened, which I think are promising for the future, is that some Uzbek products, dried fruits, nuts, herbs and spices that Uzbekistan produces, where there's a demand in the United States, have gotten certification they need to be sold in the United States. And I think they're working on melon right now. We're hoping that Uzbek melon will soon also be sold in the U.S. So those are promising things looking ahead. On the other side, of course, there's American companies that want to sell their goods here, and we try to facilitate that every time we can. But again, the WTO is going to be important, and we need to get that number up higher. You know, I know the government has set ambitious goals. Initially, I think they were hoping to get in maybe by next year. I don't know if that's realistic. The process is complicated and involves a lot of parties. It's not just the WTO itself, which is in Geneva, but Uzbekistan will have to negotiate bilaterally with a lot of other countries, with the United States, the European Union, Russia, Kazakhstan, and sign separate understandings and agreements. It's not an easy process. So I won't try to put a date on it, but all I can say is that it depends on a lot of hard work and a lot of expert advice, and we are providing some of that advice, so we're hopeful that it will move quickly. Joining WTO means meeting a certain set of international standards across the board on a lot of different things, like sanitary standards for imports, subsidies that are provided for local industries, or not having subsidies. I mean, that's the drive of WTO. And so if a country can achieve all those things that are required for membership, it also means that their economy usually becomes more transparent to investors, which is a good thing from investors' point of view. They like to know what they're coming into. And also just more consistent and more regular, more predictable. That the predictability and transparency are really important for people who want to do business. So that's an advantage of being in WTO. Also, the process of getting in requires you, as I said before, to negotiate all of these bilateral agreements with a lot of different trading partners. And again, by doing that, you are opening the door to more trade because you're agreeing on the rules with all these trading partners in writing. So it's all set. The possible cons, the possible downsides, involve certain sectors of the economy, certain industries or certain producers who have enjoyed protection in the past by the government. And in order to join WTO, those protections usually have to be either eliminated or reduced to some extent. So there are sometimes industries that lose, that are, don't do as well afterwards. But the idea is that on the whole, the country benefits, the buyers, the consumers in the country benefit, and the country becomes stronger as a producer as well because it can trade with other countries more easily. So, on the whole, we think it's a positive thing, and I think especially for Uzbekistan right now, it would be a positive.
Mr. Ambassador, which investment climate would be the best for U.S. investors?
U.S. investors, maybe not that different from investors from other countries, but look for certain things in an investment climate. I already mentioned two of them, predictability and transparency. They want to know that the rules aren't going to change all the time or just change because one person is unhappy about competition and changes the rules. So that's predictability, just knowing that there's some standards. Transparency, meaning that they have availability of information about what the local economy is about, and what the tax code is, and that all that information is available and understandable. There's two other things I think U.S. investors look for. One is fairness. They want to believe and they want to know that there's a level playing field for all competitors. So, for example, if there's a tender, a solicitation, bidding on some project, the U.S. companies want to believe that it's fair and open, and it's not going to be tilted in favor of one player, one company. The fairness means that there also has to be some judicial system, system of laws that allows you to bring complaints and have them heard and adjudicated if you have a problem. And then the last thing that they're looking for is responsiveness. By that I mean, if there is a problem, if something arises, that they have some government agency, maybe an ombudsman or something, that they can go to who will help them resolve the problem. I know that the Ministry of Investment and Foreign Trade is trying to establish that responsiveness and being available to help U.S. companies and other companies who are having problems, but it's still a work in progress. So I think the investment climate, there's some work to do, especially for companies who are already here, already operating, as opposed to new investors who might come. But I know there's a real effort being made by the government to improve it, and we're going to keep working on it to try to get more investment.
Could you outline some pros and cons of Uzbekistan's investment climate comparing to the other CIS countries?
So, well, I don't think I'm well qualified to do much comparison, but on pros and cons, I can speak to that. I think the pros include the fact that the country has a growing population with a lot of young people, both in terms of companies that are looking for consumers and who are looking for possible employees like that, because they see, there's the potential here, the human capital is here. It's also a country that I think puts a heavy emphasis on education as a value that families encourage, and so having an educated workforce with the right kind of training and skills is also really important for companies looking for investment here. So that's a pro. I think another pro is the willingness of the government to do whatever they can to facilitate and make things easier for foreign investors. It doesn't always work. It's not 100% guaranteed to work, but I do believe that the willingness is there, that to make the effort. Some of the cons are things that I already talked about before. I think there are sometimes investors who are already operating here, who are not announcing new investments but are already doing business, run into problems that involve a lack of fairness, a lack of responsiveness, a lack of predictability, those things. They come up and they sometimes have a hard time resolving them. They sometimes ask our embassy to help, and we go and talk to government officials about it. But there's still too many cases like that. And this is maybe the most important thing. Investment will come when the reputation is adequate. In other words, the reputation of a place, of a country, of having a good investment climate is the most important thing that investors are looking for. And what I mean by that is companies talk to each other, right? So if one company has a bad experience, they're going to tell everyone else about it, even their competitors, and it's going to be known. And that could lead some companies to stand back and hesitate. So establishing that reputation is really key. But going back to the pros that I mentioned before, there's so many good reasons to look at investing here that I think companies are going to keep looking, and hopefully we can work on some of those problems and improve, in all those areas that I mentioned.
I would like to ask you, what would you wish to the people of Uzbekistan?
Well, I wish the people of Uzbekistan a very happy, peaceful, and healthy upcoming year. If we start the year with Independence Day, I wish them a joyful Independence Day. And I guess I could also say, Mustaqillik Kuningiz Mubarak Bolsun.
Rahmat. Dear Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming to our studio. We were very happy to receive you.
Thank you so much. Kata Rahmat, Uzreport. Thank you for this interview, and I enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to watching it when you broadcast it.
Thank you so much. And this was Uzreport World. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.